Folks, we'll start the Lobster Board meeting in 2 minutes. Good morning. This is the American Lobster Management Board meeting, August 5th, 2014. My name is Daniel McKiernan from the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Can I get any feedback on the agenda? No feedback, so we'll assume it's approved as prepared. The proceedings from the October 2013 meeting, can I get some feedback on that? Having heard none, well, it's accepted. We'll now take public comment from the audience on any items that is not on the agenda today. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to come to the microphone and speak on items not on the agenda? Very good, having heard that. Our fourth item on the agenda is Addendum 23 for final approval. I'm going to let Kate Taylor cover this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Draft Addendum 23 contains information on the habitat needs for American lobster and does not include any proposed management changes. It was developed at the recommendation of the Commission's Habitat Committee in order to update Amendment 3's Habitat section to include information on the habitat requirements and tolerances of American lobster by life stage. The draft addendum focuses on habitat components, and these are those elements that play a vital role in the reproduction, growth, and sustainability of commercial and recreational fisheries by providing shelter, feeding, spawning, and nursery grounds for lobsters to survive. And this includes temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and other factors. For each habitat component identified, a description of the summary of habitat requirements, tolerances, and potential effects on lobsters was described in the addendum for early life stages, juveniles, and adults. The draft addendum also addresses impacts to the habitat components, including anthropogenic and ecological impacts and climate change. It also includes information on habitat bottlenecks, habitat enhancements, recommendations for further research, and recommendations for monitoring and managing lobster habitats. The public comment period ran from October 30th to December 30th, 2013, and no public comments were received. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Kate. Are there any questions on the presentation? Are there any questions or comments on the document itself? Having seen none. Oh, Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it was very well done. I read through it, and it covered about everything I could possibly think of and more. And this is what apparently is just going to be added as a section of Amendment 3. And I thought it was covered an awful lot of things, so I thought it was very good.
Thank you, Bill. I'm sure the staff appreciate that and the authors of the document. All right. Can I get a motion to approve the addendum? Motion by Bill Adler, seconded by Jim Gilmore. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor of the motion?
I'll make the motion, Brad.
All right. Bill, the complete motion, if you would.
Okay, I'll make a motion that the Lobster Board accept and approve Addendum 23 to the American Lobster Management Plan, habitat considerations.
Thank you, Bill. And the second from Jim Gilmore. Is there any opposition to the motion? Having seen none, the motion is approved. The next item on the agenda is number 5, Cancer Crab Plan Information Document for public comment, and Kate Taylor will handle that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The public information document for the cancer crab FMP was included in the supplemental material. It includes sections on the management issues, the purpose, the statement of the problem, the description of the resource, and issues for public comments. In May, as you remember, the Policy Board initiated the development of an FMP for cancer crabs. Due to the similarities in appearance between Jonah crab and rock crab, both species could be managed through the Commission's process throughout their range. The initiation of the FMP was based on recommendations from the Jonah Crab FIP, which is a multi-stakeholder effort to improve fisheries performance to a level that is consistent with the Marine Stewardship Council's Sustainable Seafood Certification. The Jonah Crab FIP was initiated by a grocery realtor when the company found that the Jonah crab did not meet the criteria for sustainable harvest in order to continue the sale of Jonah crab in its stores. The FIP conducted a pre-assessment benchmark against the MSC's sustainable seafood criteria and also organized a working group to prioritize threats to Jonah crab and develop potential management measures to address these threats. The purpose of this PID, as you know, is to gather information and provide the public an opportunity to answer the question, how would you like the fishery and population to look in the future? While Jonah crab has long been considered a bycatch in the lobster fishery, in recent years there has been increasing targeted fishing pressure and growing market demands. The status of Jonah crab fishery in federal or state waters is relatively unknown, and in the absence of a comprehensive management plan and stock assessment, the harvest of Jonah crab may compromise sustainability of the resource. Moving into the status of the stock, as I mentioned, there is no range-wide stock assessment for Jonah crab. There was a assessment conducted in state waters in Rhode Island which found that the fishing mortality exceeded FMSY, but the biomass was above the BMSY level, so therefore the fishery was not, the population was not considered overfished at this time. However, the fishery primarily occurs in federal waters, and as I mentioned, this assessment focused on state waters. There are a few inshore state water trawl surveys that only infrequently encounter cancer crab species. And additionally, there is one trawl survey conducted through NOAA Fisheries that does collect data on abundance and distribution, but this data has not yet been analyzed. Management for the fishery varies from state to state. For the commercial side, there are no maximum landing size restrictions, and all states do require some form of commercial catch reporting. In some states, the commercial licensing is linked to the lobster fishery, and in federal waters, the commercial harvest of Jonah crab is unregulated. For the recreational side, harvest is allowed in all states. Some states have varying harvest limits, while the remaining states do not have any. There are some limits on traps and licensing, as this again varies by state, and in federal waters it is unregulated. Table 1 in the PID contains information on the regulations by state. The value of the Jonah crab fishery, as was mentioned previously, has increased recently, resulting in higher landings. In 2012, the fishery was estimated to be worth over $8 million. Landings for rock crab have fluctuated between approximately 1 and 5 million pounds, and in 2012 it was estimated to be about 830,000 pounds. So moving into the issues for public comments, if approved, public comment will be collected on a series of issues that I will go through, and these are intended to focus the public and provide the board with the necessary input to develop an FMP. Issue number 1 is, should there be consistent coast-wide management? The management questions under consideration include, is consistent coast-wide management needed? Should management of cancer crab be coordinated through the Commission? Are there regional differences in the fishery or the stock that need to be considered when implementing these management measures? And should the Commission include the management of rock crab with the management of Jonah crab? Issue number 2 deals with the objectives of the FMP. The draft PID document contained in your material includes language on potential objectives for the PID and asks further, what should the objectives be? Issue number 3 deals with the management measures. Specifically, should the Commission consider minimum size restrictions, protection of female Jonah crabs, and recreational measures? Management questions that are asked, what is the level of management that is appropriate? Should the management be concurrent with monitoring requirements? Should the FMP require a 5-inch minimum carapace width for commercially caught Jonah crab with a tolerance? Should there be a minimum carapace width for rock crab with a tolerance? Should we prohibit commercial harvest of female cancer crabs or prohibit the possession of egg-bearing females? And how should the recreational fishery be managed? Issue number 4 addresses licensing. The FIP examined the Jonah crab and lobster crab fisheries in offshore federal waters and found that about 98.3% of the licensed lobstermen harvest Jonah crab from federal waters. So the management questions here, very small, address, should the FMP require a commercial license? Should it be licensed separately from lobster? Should trip limits be established? Should a recreational license be required? And how should harvest for bait purposes be addressed? Issue number 5 deals with monitoring. Currently, data collection for cancer crab varies from state to state and survey to survey. The management questions include what types of data collection programs should be initiated to monitor the fisheries, what type of fisheries independent data should be collected to help increase understanding of stock status and biology, and should fishermen be required to report harvest if used for bait purposes. Issue number 6 addresses emergency action. The FIP recommended that the Commission take emergency action to implement management measures for Jonah crab based on the increasing concern of the current and growing market for smaller female Jonah crabs. And so the management questions asked include, should emergency action be taken prior to the finalization of an FMP? If emergency actions are implemented, what should they be and when should they begin? Issue number 7 deals with federal waters. Currently, there are no regulations in federal waters for cancer crab fisheries, and the management questions include, should management in federal waters be consistent with state waters fisheries, and what recommendations should the FMP make for federal waters harvest of cancer crab? And the last issue asks if there are any other items that the FMP should address. The timeline for completion, as you see here, the board is reviewing the draft PID and will consider it for public comment today. If approved today, the public comment period would run September through October, and the management board could review the public comment received on the PID at the annual meeting and provide the PDT with input on the development of the FMP. Potentially, the management board could review a draft of the FMP for public comment at the February board meeting, with public comment following an eventual potential review of the final document for final action in May 2015. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Kate. Are there any questions on Kate's presentation? Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was out at the very beginning of the presentation, so forgive me if this is answered. I guess I'm perplexed as to how do we go forward with any management measures without a stock assessment? How do we know that measures are needed if there isn't a stock assessment done showing that there's overfishing?
Tony wants to comment on that.
We did talk about this at the policy board when we initiated the PID, and like Black Drum, the policy board had directed staff to move forward with the intention of doing a stock assessment once the management plan had been approved, and that the PID or the FMP would be general in the sense that it would be developed so that we could easily craft management measures once an assessment was put forward. It may have some basic management measures or monitoring requirements or data collection requirements that would help us inform information for an assessment or to allow some basic things to be done so that there would be some consistency. But otherwise, we would have to rely on anecdotal information that's being collected, not necessarily anecdotal, but information that's being collected by the states to use more of a stock indicators than an actual assessment.
Richie.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Has the staff looked at, as we start to get down this road, the financial implications of this, and if we get into having to develop a stock assessment, are we ready to be able to do that financially? So it seems to me like that this is mostly a federal issue, and I guess I can't get my arms around how we'll do a stock assessment, how we can afford it, and how we will carry it out.
Jim Gilmore.
Well, I had two things. First, to follow up on Richie's point, I kind of agree. We're looking at the financial aspects of trying to manage another species, and we go back to last year, we were looking at whelk, and we all decided, well, we'd go back and not have an ASMFC plan. We would just do individual state plans, which we're struggling with right now, how we're going to do that. And now I looked at this and I said, well, we're getting into priorities. It's like I don't know if we're going to have the resources both at the commission and even at the state level to do this. So there's a lot of questions about that I don't know if this is the biggest issue we need to be doing, and maybe the Fed should be looking at this more than us. And secondly, a couple of corrections on the table. The Table 1 listed New York as having a commercial minimum size. We don't have one, so that should be changed. And secondly, there was a commercial harvest limit of 50 crabs per day. It's actually, that's the recreational limit. We don't have a commercial limit, so if you can make those changes. Thank you.
Thank you. David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, going back to Richie's first point of why we should do this, Steve Train and I both participated in the GMRI process, and I think the logic for taking action, for the Commission to take action at this point, is to do something precautionary. This is an extraordinarily valuable fishery. It's becoming more valuable. Landings are escalating fairly rapidly, so the whole point in doing this is to put some really basic regulatory requirements on the fishery, namely some sort of minimum size and some type of egg-bearing female protection on the fishery, and enhance data collection aspects of it, while both the National Marine Fisheries Service and the states work together over some extended timeline to do a stock assessment. It's going to take a while to do that stock assessment. In fact, Bob Glenn can speak to this, but he put in a pretty extensive, well-researched proposal to look at the sexual maturity aspects of Jonah crabs, and it wasn't funded by the SK solicitation, but that type of research is going to take time to develop, And the whole point is to be precautionary, try to get ahead of this, and put a set of regulations that kind of ensure the long-term viability of the resource. So in terms of the economic consequences for the Commission, I think that the discussion there is focused on, if we just do a basic plan with a few measures, it shouldn't cost us a lot of money. And we only get into the more expensive aspects of Jonah crab management, like a full-blown stock assessment, if the resources develop. Otherwise, you just have these core management measures that stay in place and hopefully ensure the viability of the fishery and the resource. Thank you.
Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As to the rationale for why we want to act before we have a detailed comprehensive stock assessment, I think Figure 1 tells me that I should be concerned. As a fishery manager, landings have increased by a factor of 6 since 1990. I think in our past experiences, when landings explode on an unregulated species, it's not because abundance has increased by a factor of 6. It's usually that effort is increased greatly for whatever reason, displacement out of the lobster fishery and poor performance there. And we probably have an exploitation rate that is mounting rapidly and could very well have already exceeded sustainable rates. I don't know what the abundance is doing in the primary areas of the fishery, but the long-term trawl survey, Graduate School of Oceanography in Narragansett Bay, has been declining at over the same time period. This great increase in landings has taken place. I don't know what the other states' inshore surveys, if they even count cancer crabs, I don't know. But what little information we do have, I think, is alarming for an unregulated species and begs some basic management measures. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Any other comments? Tom?
Yeah, just in Table 1 on the summary of regulations, it appears that the Maryland regulations are for blue crabs rather than Jonah crabs, as we don't have any. We do require a commercial license of land, but if that section could be updated. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad Richie actually brought this up because it leads into a point that I think is important. I suggested to Kate that the document include the problem statement out of the GMRI document. And just for those of you that can't recall that problem statement gets into about 5 different issues, problems that are created by an unregulated fishery, and I think it's important to just include those, and then we can, when this goes out for public discussion, we can have a discussion with the constituents about. There are going to be people that are going to stand up at public information hearings and basically say they want to oppose us moving forward with crab management. And I think all of us should be prepared to deal with that, and that's what the problem statement gets into. In other words, it's more explicit than what Kate put in here. There's a whole list of like whale entanglements, circumvention of the trap cut regulations in the lobster plan. If we include that, then I think it's a lot easier for all of us to defend this action. Thank you.
So, Kate, you want to respond?
Sure. I just want to make sure that the board is aware of what the statement of the problem would read and what that would add. There are a number of bullet points in the FIPS report, and so this would add the crab resource is unregulated in federal waters, with most of the landings coming from Area 3. Landings and effort are increasing rapidly in an unregulated manner. There are no minimum size protections for Jonah crab, nor are there regulations to project spawning biomass, including restrictions on the harvest of females. If left unregulated, the expanding crab fishery threatens the effectiveness of the lobster industry's conservation measures to reduce traps in the water and avoid interactions with right whales. Supermarkets and other major buyers are positioning to discontinue selling processed and whole Jonah crab unless it is managed sustainably. With the loss of market access, the ex-vessel price of Jonah crab is likely to decline, and with the continued unregulated harvest of Jonah crab, the long-term availability of this resource for harvest is compromised.
So, Kate, can we bring all 5 of those points into the PID?
Oh, we can add that to the document.
Steve Train?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To speak to some of the things Richie spoke about earlier, if we wait to regulate a species till we have more information, having harvested a lot of these different species, it seems like by the time we start regulating them, we're already in trouble. This is a healthy resource that means a lot to the coastal economies in these states. And if we wait much longer, the effort escalation without regulation is going to do serious harm to it.
Walter?
What he said.
Thank you, Walter. Doug Grout, did you want to speak to this issue?
Yeah, Kate, I was wondering, I noticed that, the NIMS survey had collected the information, but it said the data had not been analyzed. If we were to put together a PID or an amendment, is there a possibility that the Commission or the Technical Committee could get access to that data and just do basic catch per tow information? Same thing with the Mass survey and the Maine, New Hampshire survey. That might give us some fisheries independent information, which might, even though it's not a formal stock assessment, it would give us an idea of what relative abundance is doing over the years, and would help inform the public as to what's happening here.
Bob Goyne, want to speak to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To answer your question, Doug, the answer is yes, we can, and we already have to some degree. Myself and another member of my staff, as well as individuals from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Burton Shanks, and a few other scientists have worked with the GMRI group. Part of that process is we've been putting together all the fisheries-dependent and fisheries-independent data for Jonah crabs that are available. This includes all the NIMS trawl survey indices. So we do have them. We are in the process of reviewing them, and so we have some idea.
Bill Adler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I think we should move ahead for all the reasons that has already been mentioned, and remembering that the PID is only one step in seems a very long format where we can maybe get some more information, like stock analysis or whatever. But I think it would behoove us to move ahead with this particular thing. I think it would be very helpful if we could put a picture of a Jonah crab versus a rock crab in, because people go, I got crab all over the place. Which one is this one? That would be probably a helpful thing to put in the document. But I think we should move ahead with this. It's going to take a while anyway. And my other question was, we need to talk to the federal people. Because if we put something forward like this, I know we have some control, but does that mean it'll be 3 years, 4 years from now before the federal rule is in? I still think we should move ahead with this. Okay.
David Borden, do you want to speak next?
I don't have an answer for Bill, but I was going to ask you whether or not you want a motion. You ready?
Bob Beal wanted to speak first.
I just had a quick follow-up for the Tech Committee Chair. Bob, what's the timeline on pulling together some of that basic information? Is it quick enough to get it in this PID if the board wants to move forward with this for hearings between this meeting and the annual meeting, or is that product more of something that could be included in the second step, in the draft amendment, should the board choose to go that route?
We have in hand the basic fisheries dependent in like catch information by state, as well as trawl survey indices for different states, as well as Northeast Fisheries Science Center data. We could get it together. We have it in hand. We could get it together pretty quickly. For this time, yeah.
All right. With no other discussion, I'd accept a motion to approve the PID. David Borden?
Yeah, I'll make that motion, Mr. Chairman, with the additional language that Kate suggested. So move.
Second from Bill Adler. Comments from the audience. Dick Allen, come to the microphone.
Good morning. My name's Dick Allen. I'm here representing the Little Bay Lobster Company, and you shouldn't really take my comments as any kind of a position on the issues, but I would like to make some suggestions that might improve the public information document. So I wanted to comment on the document specifically. We appreciate the willingness of the Commission to respond to the initiative of people in the fishery and the industry, and look forward to you following up on this. We do think there's a need for management. The first thing is I noticed there doesn't seem to be a conservation or sustainability objective in the list of possible objectives, which seemed odd to me that it didn't list conservation of the resource as one of the objectives. I think it would be improved by doing that. The second thing is the emphasis on the prohibition on taking female crabs. We take a lot of female lobsters. I was surprised. I know the FIP working group had that emphasis, but I would expect the Commission to take a little more objective and scientifically based approach. And as far as I know, there's no biological basis for a complete prohibition on taking females. So I think both in that suggestion and in the emergency action, that could be a little more explanation as to whether that's a fundamental biological issue or not. As far as I know, there's no issue, no biological reason or evidence that some take of female crabs wouldn't be acceptable, as it is in just about every other fishery we have. I'm wondering if you could include a shell height minimum size in addition to the carapace width, in thinking about how people are going to sort crabs and just reducing the cost of any potential regulation. I know that Connecticut, for example, in their hard clam fishery has both a diameter regulation and a shell height regulation, and it seems to me that having that option and getting comments on that might be a good idea, that you could have either or a carapace width or a shell height. The tolerance on either the minimum size or females, seems to me we learned a lot about tolerances and the enforcement issues that they create. They seem like a great idea when you say, well, this is a big volume fishery, we don't want to hold anybody to real tight compliance, everybody makes a mistake, things like that, so we'll put a tolerance in. And what we learned in sea scallop management is that the tolerance sometimes becomes the standard, and when you are dealing with volumes, the only way to enforce a tolerance is to take samples, and one sample doesn't give you confidence that you actually know what the entire catch is, so then you have to get into statistics and how many samples you need and what your confidence limits are and all of those things that go with tolerances. So I wanted to suggest that at least you include an option in the document that might have an absolute measure as a tolerance. The red crab fishery management plan, the federal FMP for red crab allows one standard tote of females in a trip. And so that kind of, you don't get into sampling. If you come up, you're watching a trip unload and you pick out the crabs, you fill a tote, you've got a violation there. You don't get into all the statistical issues that go with the tolerance. So I think including that for public comment might be a good idea. I don't see anything about escape vents in the document, and it seems like that might be something that people would want to consider, along with the idea of having a minimum size, that one way to help with that might be an escape vent. So I think it would be good to include or ask for comments on escape vent requirements. Excuse me. Forgot to do that. Again, the emergency action request creates the impression, and in my mind, this is with the kind of the weight of the commission behind it, that there is something inherently wrong with taking female crabs. And I don't think you should be giving that impression, that there ought to be some way to ask those questions in a more objective fashion. And I also had the same question about whether that federal trawl survey data would be analyzed, and that question has been answered, and we'd look forward to that.
Dick, can I ask you a question about the shell height? And your reputation, precedes you as being a very creative and a guy who can solve problems. Do you actually know of a gauge or a measuring technique that height on a crab could be measured?
I don't see why not. I mean, the whole idea behind escape vents is that there is some size that animals can go through, and it just, in thinking about the difficulties of measuring carapace width on high volumes of crab, it just seemed to me that one option, whether it's workable, whether people would think it was a good idea or not. I think in the quahog fishery, one of the reasons that people went to that was that it increased the ability for people to sort quahogs quickly. And whether it would work with Jonah crabs, I don't know, but I think it's worth consideration, because I think it's going to be very costly to ask people to measure carapace width, and I think it's going to be difficult for enforcement people to do a lot of measuring of carapace width on crabs. So if there's an easier way to do it, I think we ought to at least consider it.
Okay, Dick, so you've asked for 3 changes to the document: incorporation of shell height, a tolerance on the undersized, non-conforming crabs, and a reference to escape vents. Can I get any feedback from the board to whether to include those?
And the tolerance that I suggested was specifically, there's already a tolerance included in the document. I'd suggest that we might get comments on whether an absolute number would be preferable to a percentage tolerance, because of all the statistical issues that you get into with sampling for percentages.
Thank you, Dick. All right, I'm going to turn back to the board and get comments. Doug Grount?
Yeah, I would support at least including these as in the PID to get comments on.
David Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Dick brought up a number of good points, and unless there's an objection by Mr. Adler, I'd suggest we just include that.
Thank you. Any objections to doing that? Hearing none, thank you. All right, so we do have a motion on the board. Joe Fessenden, want to speak to the issues?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we, in Maine, crab is a bycatch fishery and the lobster fishery. But we had a few years ago, we had several fishermen came to the department and wanted to go crab fishing in addition to the lobster traps. So we got an approved crab trap design in Maine, and it's something you may want to consider in the document to actually have an approved crab trap that would allow fishers to have more than their just their lobster traps. Just an idea.
All right, so we can include that in the document. All right, yes, Tom Fode.
I'm just curious, does that crab trap also catch lobsters, or are lobsters excluded from the trap just because of the design?
Joe?
Well, in theory, they exclude lobsters, catching lobsters. And they don't always work, but the bycatch certainly of lobster is diminished significantly with that current design. And we basically got them on 4-foot traps. I mean, they're not just small crab traps and stuff. They've got them in fairly large traps, and they seem to work for Jonah crab.
All right, David Simpson.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an important point, because I think one of the central questions we're going to have to answer is, are we going to manage Jonahs as part of the lobster fishery, or are there going to be options for a parallel fishery? So I think this is an important thing to ask early on.
Thank you. That's a good point. All right, so we have a motion on the board. Shall I read it? Motion to approve the cancer crab PID with the additional language as modified today. Motion by David Borden, seconded by Mr. Adler. Is there any objections, or should we do a roll call on that?
Either objection or raise your hands.
Yeah, all right. Let's raise our hands. All in favor of the motion? Any objections to the motion? Any null votes? It's unanimous. Thank you. All right, the next item on the agenda is a review of Addendum 17's effect on the Southern New England 10% reduction, and the evaluation will be done by the Chair of the Technical Committee, Bob Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, a little background on the information. Per Addendum 17, all lobster conservation management areas within southern New England were required to reduce exploitation by 10% in order to address rebuilding. The reference base years for evaluating the reduction were the 2007 to 2009 period. The regulations that each LCMT decided to put forward were provided in the briefing materials in detail, but just to summarize those quickly, for Area 2, the highlight of that program was a mandatory V-notching program. Area 3 enacted a 3 and 17 32nd inch minimum size increase. Area 4 enacted a mandatory V-notching program in addition to a February 1st through March 31st seasonal closure. Area 5 also conducted the mandatory V-notching program, and as well as a seasonal closure from February 1st to March 31st. And finally, Area 6 adopted a seasonal closure from September 8th through November 28th. That was for the 2013 year. Just a little bit of background information. Because calculating relative exploitation requires you to conduct a full assessment model, the TC can evaluate the actual exploitation rate to see if the management measures enacted were successful at reducing exploitation. So what we used we used nominal landings as a proxy, and this was discussed with the board prior to when these regulations were being passed. We discussed this with the board, and that this would be an issue. So what was used as a measuring stick essentially was the reduction in catch from that baseline 2007 to 2009 period. So we're going to go through north to south for each of the states that had regulations that they had to put into effect. For Massachusetts, in comparison to the reference years, landings declined by 12.4%. There has been a dramatic declining fishing effort and active permits since the late 1990s. Although the current active fishers are reporting higher catches, overall there are fewer people in the fishery. So the consensus was that Mass did meet the 10% reduction based on landings. However, it was very likely that this was not due to implementation of the V-notching program, but rather due to substantial decline in fishing effort. The V-notching program in LCME 2 is likely not the best management tool for this area because it relies on fairly high fishing levels. So just a little context there. Unlike the Gulf of Maine, where it's in Area 1, rather, where it's a very successful conservation tool, it relies on fairly high fishing mortality rates or encounter rates. So in order to V-notch egg-bearing female lobsters, you actually have to catch a substantial portion. They have to come across the rail for the fishermen, and then they're V-notched and put back. In LMA 2, and specifically I speak in Massachusetts here, but I think you'll see a similar case in Rhode Island, that because fishing effort has declined so much, the catch rates aren't high enough to actually observe enough egg-bearing females to V-notch a substantial portion and put them back. So it's kind of one of the limitations of that technique in an area where there's low abundance and also low exploitation rates. Moving on to Rhode Island, relative to the reference years of 2007 to 2009, landings have declined by 25%. The consensus from the TC was that Rhode Island met the 10% reduction in requirement based on landings. The TC finds that the reduction was not due to the implementation of the V-notch program in LCMA 2, but due to a decline in effort as well. The TC wasn't able to evaluate the effect of the gauge increase in LCMA 3 in Rhode Island, and that goes for for Massachusetts as well. We don't get very much in the way of biological sampling out in LCMA 3, and as a result of that, we didn't have any updated length frequency distributions of the commercial catch from that area to be able to evaluate to see if a gauge increase was successful at reducing their catch or not. Moving to Connecticut, landings in 2013 were 68% lower than they were in 2009. The seasonal closure did reduce landings, but overall landings continued to drop as well. And the consensus from the TC was that Connecticut achieved a greater than 10% reduction in landings, most of which can be attributed to the implementation of a seasonal closure, but also due to decreased market demand, decreased abundance, and less effort. At the time that this was put together, we did not have, there was an issue with the New York landings data. Those have since been resolved, but we did not have, and the TC did not have an opportunity to review the New York plan prior to this meeting. So we can give an update on that. I do believe New York's representative on the TC, Kim McCown, just sent out late this week, after the landings issues have been fixed, a review for the TC to look at, and I'm assuming that we will look at that via email quickly, and we can send updated information on that. Moving on to New Jersey. So we'll break it down by the three LCMAs for New Jersey. In LCMA 3, for New Jersey boats, there was a 42% reduction in catch. But this was likely due to the loss of one of the three main boats in that fishery. The TC representative from New Jersey described that one of the major players in that fishery had moved to another area, so landings dropped in that case were likely not due to implementation of any of the management measures, but likely because that large player left. In LCMA 4, landings increased by 3.26% in comparison to the reference base years. However, in LCMA 5, there was a 33% reduction in catch. The consensus was that the required reduction was achieved in LCMA 3 and LCMA 5, but was not achieved in LCMA 4. The TC felt that implementation of the seasonal closure and VNOC program had mixed success. For LCMAs 4 and 5, the TC recommends that the LCMT should review the seasonal closure timing to possibly look at dates that are more effective. And we also reiterated the same that we did for LCMA 2, that a mandatory VNOC program might not be the best method to regulate catch in any of the southern New England stocks, because of the exploitation rates are fairly low, making the encounter rates low. Finally, from Maryland, and Maryland would have fisheries in, I believe it's LMA 5, Kate? Yeah, and for LMA 5, was overall their landings have increased since the reference period. The consensus was that Maryland did not achieve the 10% reduction. Landings have actually increased since the reference period. However, we did note that Maryland has less than 1% of the coastwide landings, and this increase had very limited impact on the southern New England stock. So if we take the state-by-state breakdown and then just give kind of a status update for each of the management areas, it looks as follows. For Area 2 and 3, the required reduction was met, but the TC felt it was likely not due to the implemented management measures. Areas 4 and 5, the required reductions were not achieved. And overall, we saw increases in landings in those management areas. In Area 6, the required reduction was met, and much of the reduction could be attributed to the management measures. And that's it for the presentation.
Thank you, Bob. Any questions? David Simpson first.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for the presentation. So I wonder, when we adopted Addendum 2017 and approved V-notching or closed seasons, one of the things I thought we would look at carefully was evidence that the mandatory V-notching was actually happening. One of the advantages of a closed season is we can for certain and very effectively monitor and enforce that. Gear had to be removed from the water even, but with the V-notching, there's no certainty that compliance with mandatory V-notching was being achieved. So there was discussion of monitoring through C-sampling, the proportion of egg-bearing females that were V-notched, and from ventless traps. So did the TC look at any of that? Have the states that have, significant Area 2 fisheries provided any of that information?
Yes, they have. And in fact, is something we can pull up, Kate, or should I just describe it? So I'll just describe. What we did was each state was required to construct a memo looking at the effectiveness of the plan that their LCMAs had put into place. For part of that, for example, all the states, including Mass, Rhode Island, and New Jersey, who chose V-notching programs, included within this document the report on the effectiveness of the plan, observed rates of V-notching in commercial C-sampling as well as the ventless trap survey. What we found was that, say, for example, in Massachusetts, we did see an increase in V-notching, but a very small increase, certainly not as much as we would have anticipated had there been a large amount of V-notching occurring. Similar things were observed in both Rhode Island and in New Jersey, where there was detectable increase in V-notching, but it was overall extremely small.
David, follow up?
So then in terms of compliance, it doesn't sound like we have a great deal of confidence that within Area 2, for example, there's much compliance with Addendum 17. And landings is a very simple proxy, and I understand until we have an assessment, we don't know what exploitation rate reduction we've achieved. But certainly in Area 6, I believe we got some conservation benefit out of a 3-month closed season. I would probably not agree with the statement that much of the 68% reduction was attributable to our closed season. We closed a season that we expected to achieve a 10% reduction, and I don't think we got much more than that. I do think we may have had some benefit of, which I've been hoping for, once the gear is out and people are out of the habit of fishing at nearly no profit level or maybe no profit level, maybe they decide not to put the gear back in the spring, and I think we've had some of that, so maybe some additional benefit, but we probably would have achieved a 58% reduction, without any closed season at all. And I'm concerned in terms of, what do I tell my people who are living through a 3-month closure? Is there conservation equivalency going on? And at this point, I don't feel like there is in Area 2 or 3.
No, I think your point is well taken, David, that it's much easier to gauge the success of a closed season. One thing that makes it difficult for us to tease out what's going on in V-notching is that, for example, in the mass portion of Area 2, we've had in excess of an additional 40% attrition in the industry, and so the effort rates have declined dramatically. So I can't tease out whether there's been poor compliance with the regulation or if it's that overall fishing effort is so low, they're simply just not catching enough egg-bearing. The combined industry that's left working on that stock isn't catching enough egg-bearing lobsters to V-notch them in for it to show up as a sizable increase. So it's a little bit of a semantic point, but I have a feeling that overall the compliance rate was okay. It's just there's so few doing it. Thanks.
Go ahead, David, one more.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but this was the concern I had with V-notching from the outset, and I know when Connecticut and New York had used V-notching as a conservation equivalency tool, we were held to a very high bar. We had to demonstrate through direct observation a certain number of lobsters being V-notched, and we didn't have that here. Has there been any law enforcement activity trying to observe fishermen to see whether they're using notching tools, whether they have them on the boat, any kind of, call it surveillance of their behavior out there to get a sense of whether there was, adequate compliance?
Not that I am aware of.
I have Steve Train next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a great slide. It makes things pretty clear. I mean, red, we haven't met it, but the yellow, Area 2 and 3. So we got lucky. Does this mean that we didn't do enough for other reasons? We got lucky, and so there still needs to be something done, or do we just sit back and say we met it so we can put that one behind us, even though it wasn't something we did? The red and the green seem pretty clear, but the yellow one leaves me wondering, so what do we do?
What the yellow indicates for Area 2 and 3 were that the reductions that occurred in fishing effort and participation in general far outweighed any signal that we could detect by the regulation, so that when you have such dramatic declines in fishing effort, you're going to see tremendous reductions in catch. And that's what was observed in Area 2 and Area 3. We saw dramatic declines in catch. As far as how to address it going forward, I think that's something that the board collectively would need to discuss as what a good strategy would be moving forward for southern New England.
Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to respond a bit to Dave's concerns about compliance. I don't think it's so much a matter of compliance. It's that the resource and fishing effort is essentially evaporated in at least in state waters of Area 2. Our spring fall survey this year caught 4 lobsters and 44 tows. We used to catch in the double digits per tow. Our fall survey last year, I think, caught 12, and that's the definitive total. We used to catch, 20 per tow. That's the definitive one for at least our contribution to stock assessment. The ventless trap survey is at its historic low point since 2006. Settlement has been, basically 4 bust years in a row, even notwithstanding the slight uptick we had this year. I mean, the bottom has just fallen completely out of the resource. Our measures of effort are at low points, a number of traps being fished, trap tags being ordered. We have trouble finding anybody to go sea sampling with, except for the handful of people who still know where there's a couple of pockets of lobsters, and hence the catch per trap haul remains hyper stable because we're down to a handful of guys that still know where there's a few left. That's inherently a very dangerous situation, by the way, when we're still inflicting mortality on a contracted and reduced stock. Witness the Gulf of Maine cod news we just got this last week. So I don't think it's a matter of compliance. It's just there's nothing left to V-notch, and there's hardly anybody out there to do it. And we're looking for a needle in a haystack now of trying to find a V-notch lobster amongst everything else that we're catching. Thanks.
David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To go back to Steve Train's question, though, to me, I look at the results. The results are mixed. Some areas didn't achieve the result, and I think what Steve is asking is how do we react to that? My answer to that is you're going to have a full-blown stock assessment, peer-reviewed stock assessment going forward in the next 6 to 9 months. And at that point, when you get the most up-to-date information on the stock assessment, then I think we have to reflect back on the analysis that's been done and decide whether or not we need to do more and how much more we need to do. So that's my response to that.
David Simpson.
Yeah, so assuming we've sort of gotten beyond the question and answer with Bob and are talking about the now what portion of this, my problem is, we do have a closed season for 3 months. We require fishermen to pull their gear out of the water and go do something else for 3 months, and then if they want to fish again, they have to put all that gear back in the water, which is an inconvenience to say the least for them, and so some of them are asking us, they've made the same comments, and they've made them in the newspaper. We've achieved way more than a 10% reduction. We've achieved a 68% reduction. You should relieve us of this burden of having a closed season. And so I'm not sure what to say to them differently. I certainly don't. I mean, we do have the ability to implement, as an alternative, a mandatory V-notch program, and we could do that and do away with the closed season. I wouldn't feel very good about it, but if this is the problem that I foresaw when we approved V-notching as an alternative to a closed season, I can probably I can statistic for statistic match what Mark is saying about how dismal the fishery is in Long Island Sound. It's horrendous. The lowest trawl survey index we've had in 30 years, and the lowest landings we've had in more than 30 years, and so forth. And I just don't know what to tell people at home if we just kind of, looks like they V-notched some lobsters, area 2 and 3, they're okay. I'm not sure what I'll tell people if they really push for V-notching instead of a closed season back in Long Island Sound.
David, to that point, if you did adopt a V-notching program, I think experience has shown over in Mass and Rhode Island, you may not encounter enough animals to accomplish the goal.
We absolutely won't. And that's the problem. And you won't really know again, how you did on exploitation until we have another stock assessment, but, I don't want it to sound like sour grapes, but I think for good reason, the board, when we used V-notching several years ago, required that we document 30,000 V-notched lobsters. So it was independent of the population size. If you don't V-notch 30,000 lobsters or more, then you have failed to achieve the conservation objective, and you have to go to Plan B, which was a gauge increase for us. And we did. We fell short by several thousand lobsters, and we had to go to a gauge increase. And there's nothing here in this Addendum 17 to say, well, you fell short. The stock has fallen. You've fallen short. You need to go to a closed season or a gauge increase or something else that's more enforceable and more verifiable.
Mark Gibson?
Yeah, the other point I forgot to make when I last spoke is that our ability to detect a 10% reduction in exploitation is nil. Even with a fully updated stock assessment, we wouldn't be able to detect that. It's the coefficients of variation on the model parameters and your terminal estimates or any estimate of exploitation is going to have a wider confidence bound than that, so we won't be able to detect it anyways. So we're kind of we set ourselves up for failure on this one. I mean, it was very clear in the North Cape program when millions of lobsters were being V-notched, you could see the effect on the extension of the size composition of the females, the reductions in mortality rate that occurred. We just didn't anticipate that the bottom was going to fall out of this thing and we wouldn't have the animals to V-notch or the fishing power to do it. But in hindsight, the ability for us to on paper, specify a 10% reduction, but then where the rubber hits the road, actually estimate it. We don't have the ability to do it, and we won't when the full, main size-based model is updated. At least not in my opinion, anyways.
Richie White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the situation that we found ourselves in is exactly what the technical committee told us. The technical committee recommended a moratorium, and we did it 10%. And the population has followed exactly what the technical committee said would happen. It's collapsed and getting worse. And that we, probably doesn't make any difference to limit mortality because it's probably, going to end up not being any eventually anyway. But, I think this, follows what was predicted.
I'd like to just comment on maybe David Simpson's point that, that is a fair point about the issue of the closures, and I believe there was some talk of a contingency in like an Area 2 for a closure if the objectives weren't met. And we are about to embark on some very serious trap allocation reductions down that way, and it's my experience in the Outer Cape that if you do have a seasonal haul-out period, it certainly enhances the enforceability of the permit-specific trap limits. So maybe that's something that we ought to be thinking about going forward. Any other comments? So, Bob, the assessment, and I know you're going to get into this shortly, the assessment is going to be out by December or next meeting, November? What's your forecast on that?
Assessment will be completed and probably and ready for review at the February meeting. No, May. Sorry, May meeting. I don't have the presentation in front of me. Sorry about that.
So, Kate, is it the Commission's view that the LCMTs need to be reconvened in those areas where the reductions appear not to be met?
In those areas where the reduction was not met, the states will have to convene the LCMTs and develop regulations to meet the 10% reduction. However, as it was noted, the New York report was not included in the evaluation, so that could help out the LCMA for landings if those reductions have increased or have decreased. So we'll have to factor that in. So there might be some, so that LCMA may come into compliance, but for LCMA 5, they will have to likely go back and reevaluate those measures in order to meet the 10% reduction.
So can this issue be brought up again at the November meeting after the New York data is incorporated?
Yes, the New York report, as Bob mentioned, was sent to staff late on Friday, and that is going to be distributed to the TC, so we can actually let the board know, hopefully after some TC review over email, what the results of that was.
So is this an issue that we can move to the November meeting in terms of a holistic view of the exploitation rates in the southern New England stock, and then task the LCMTs after November to get together?
It was the discussion at the TC meeting that staff would work with the states to convene the LCMTs to develop recommendations. So at the November meeting, we would know what the regulations would be for the coming year.
That would mean what the LCMTs would propose, not necessarily the regulations, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right, is there any objection to that plan and that schedule? David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not an objection, but I think it would be helpful if the staff sent out a memo to all the states basically outlining what Kate just said. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, we can move on to the next issue, number 7, update on upcoming federal actions, and NIMS's Peter Burns is going to present on that. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to give you a quick update on where we're at with our various rules and regulations on the federal side. Next slide, please. So, let's see. In April, we published a final rule, and that implemented regulations to do a limited access program for Area 2 in the Outer Cape area. Those are the last 2 areas in federal waters that don't have a cap on effort. So we began soliciting applications in May, and we'll be taking applications from federal lobster permit holders through November 3rd, 2014, and we'll be reviewing those for their eligibility, and those that are eligible will get a trap allocation based on their historical fishing practices. To date, we've got about 130 applications in. Most of those were pre-approved in looking at data with the states, so we have most of those folks really could be ready to be approved at any time, and we have about 190 or 200 applicants in that same situation, so we'll be trying to reach out to those folks again, those extra 70 or so federal permit holders, to try to get them in, get the applications in, and complete this process as soon as we can. That new regulation, the rule that we published, also implemented the trap transfer rules, so we have those in place, but we're waiting for the trap tag database to come into play so that we can get transferability started. And since then, we published just last Friday a proposed rule seeking public comment on the Southern New England stock rebuilding measures, the same measures we were just discussing previously. We'll be accepting comments on this through August 25th, and so we're happy that the comment period falls in the middle during this Lobster Board meeting to give you folks a chance to give us some comments. These measures are consistent with the Commission's recommendations in Addendum 17 and 18 to reduce fishing exploitation by 10%, that was Addendum 17, and reduce latent effort and scale the fishery to diminish the diminished size of the Southern New England resource, that was Addendum 18, both in 2012. And you can see these are the measures. These are consistent with what the Commission has asked us to implement. There's a mandatory V-notching requirement for Area 2, Area 4, and Area 5, and a gauge increase in Area 3 up to 3 and 17/32 inches, and a seasonal closure from February 1 to March 31st in both Areas 4 and 5. And we also are proposing the grace periods on either end of the closed season to allow fishermen to get their gear out and put gear back in so it doesn't completely disrupt their business practices. And here's another issue that is being proposed These are the Addendum 18 trap cuts. This is a 25% cut in year 1 for Area 2, and then in 5 subsequent years, 5% cut each year for just under 50% overall cut. For Area 3, another suite of trap cuts totaling just under 25%, and that's 5% for 5 years in a row. And we proposed that the trap cuts take place starting at the next fishing year, as well as the other broodstock measures starting May 1, effective May 1, 2015. But in the meantime, when we wrote this proposed rule, it was contingent upon the database being completed. So we've got a situation here, a timing issue, that we'd really like to get the board's comments on, because we've got trap transferability and we've got trap cuts. The trap tag database isn't ready to go yet, so we can't allow fishermen to start transferring traps. And if we implement the trap cuts, if we implement trap cuts first without the opportunity for fishermen to transfer traps, it could cause some economic problems for them because they won't be able to mitigate the trap cut issues. So one of the things we did, without wanting to slow the process down, we're proposing that the trap cuts be implemented at the start of the 2015 fishing year. But even if trap transferability becomes an option with a completed database in the near future, the window of opportunity for fishermen to get together, to make deals, to be able to transfer traps during a reasonable part of the 2014 fishing year, where we're at right now, is closing rapidly. So it's going to complicate the ability for us to be able to qualify and allocate these fishermen, number one. Then implement the trap cuts and tell them what their cut allocation is going to be, number two. And then number three, allow them the process and the time to be able to effectively buy up enough traps so that they can get back up and mitigate from the trap cuts. And for Area 2, of course, that's a significant cut in year 1. It's 25%. So one of the things we specifically asked for comment on is, even though we're proposing implementing these cuts in the start of the 2015 fishing year, asking specifically for comments from the board about the timing of this with respect to trap transferability, and even the option of potentially moving the cuts up 1 year to allow the trap transfer database to come up to speed, for us to be able to outreach to the public and let everybody know what they need to do to transfer traps, allow the trap transfers to become effective, and then permit holders would be able to transfer traps based on that cut amount. So they'd be essentially cut and be able to mitigate during the same fishing year, which is, in our interpretation, really what the Commission had in mind when it crafted Addendum 18 to put trap cuts in place contemporaneously with trap reductions. So thanks for your time, and if you have any questions, let me know, but we're really interested in your comments specifically on the timing of the trap cuts. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions for Peter on his presentation? Bill Adler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things. First of all, I'd like to ask Peter what the difference is in the federal proposal that is out now versus what our addendum came up with. I know, we did this already in one of the addendums, and then the federal people have to put their word in. My first question is there anything different in the federal proposal from what we already sort of approved in our state addendum? That's my first question, and then maybe if I could have a follow-up on another question.
Peter, want to respond to that?
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We tried to follow the recommendations of the Commission throughout this whole process, and we're really actually talking about two different rules here. And in the first instance is our final rule that we're implementing now. That is the limited access program in Area 2 in the Outer Cape and the trap transferability program. We had a proposed rule a year ago, and we really didn't deviate substantially from that proposed rule. We looked at the public comments, and we really kept things the same. The only thing that we tweaked on that was the issue with multiple allowing multiple histories in a trap transfer situation. Initially, when we wrote our proposed rule, the Commission's plan called for, in Addendum 12, called for only allowing a trap that had history in a multiple area for the buyer of that trap to maintain only one specific area. Since then, in our work with the Trap Tag Database Working Group, we got some confidence that the Trap Tag database would be able to track those multi-area trap histories. And subsequently, the Commission adopted Addendum 21 that allowed for multi-area history, and so that was a very convenient thing for us, because then we were able to spin that into our proposed rule to be even that much more consistent with what the Commission had done for this. And then we've got our other rule. It's a proposed rule right now, so this is trying to keep on track with what's happening. All the broodstock measures in Addendum 17 are exactly the same as those that were adopted by the Commission and recommended for federal implementation in the Commission's plan. And I think one thing we've tried to do in staying consistent with the plan is really just wrap in a lot more detail into what we've done with these rules. And I think anyone who's read through these can see that we tried to take all the pieces, tried to read the public comments, tried to really glean what the intent of the board was in putting together two separate programs that really overlap. One of those programs being an economically based trap transfer program that's geared toward allowing fishermen to be able to have more flexibility in their businesses, number one. Then number two, a very different process, which is a effort control trap reduction process which is really geared toward improving the stock and scaling the fishery to the stock. But ultimately, what we found is that the fishermen couldn't have one without the other. They understand the need for the reductions, but they also need the trap transferability to be able to mitigate through that, the ones that are going to stay into the fishery. So we tried to build a lot of that detail into our plan and kind of see through this, and now we've sort of teed it up for the board to be able to give us some guidance on how we're going to do these two things in a way that's reasonable and effective.
David, Bill Adler had a follow-up. Sorry, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could ask Peter, on one of these plans, and I was trying to follow it, it says if you sell a trap allocation from 2, 3, or Outer Cape, you lose Area 1. Eligibility, but if you buy from 2, 3, or whatever, you can keep your Area 1 eligibility. I get very confused there as to example of how that would work, and I didn't know if there was somebody could explain it to me.
Bill, I think the reason you're confused is in your state, the agency only allows one LMA for the inshore fishery, and so maybe Peter can explain how that works for the offshore fishery.
Yeah, again, getting back to your last question, Bill, this is exactly what the Commission had asked us to do. This is something that came about in Addendum 12, which is really one of the foundational documents for trap transferability, and sort of laid down the ground rules for how transferability was going to work. And the fact that Addendum 1, we did a limited access program for Area 1, but it's not an individual permit-based trap allocation the same way all the other areas are. In Area 2 and all the other areas, we've qualified and allocated traps based on a permit's specific fishing history as it relates to the eligibility requirements that have been laid down by the Commission. So that's separate from Area 1, which is really a trap cap, and we cap the number of federal permits at current permit holders and gave everybody, you bought one trap tag, you get 800 traps. So now we don't have an administrative way to deduct somebody's allocation if they had an Area 1 allocation and maybe a seasonal allocation of 300 Area 3 traps. If they sell those Area 3 traps, we don't have any way to deduct their Area 1 allocation consistent with how this plan works. So what we're saying, consistent with what the Commission has asked us to do, is those people can buy traps. They can buy transferable traps from Area 3, Area 2 of the Outer Cape, but if they sell them, they're going to lose their Area 1 eligibility. But in some cases, that may be a good economic option for somebody who's trying to get out of the business or is retooling their business somehow. But certainly, they can still buy traps.
David Borden, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I think I have a number of comments on Peter's proposal, but I think the way to expedite the discussion here is to focus on the database. And is the database ready? And if it's not ready, when is it going to be ready? I mean, we've been talking about this for years, and it's totally impossible, I think, either for the National Marine Fisheries Service or the Commission to get on with implementing these proposals unless we have the database. That's a key issue. So can somebody tell me exactly what the status of that
is? Kate, would you like to take a first crack at that, and I'll help you?
Some of the state data has been uploaded into the database and is ready to go. We're waiting for verification and the finalization of the remainder of the states, and then once we have that, we'll work with NIMS to enter their data. So it is very close to being ready, and hopefully can be turned on very soon, within the next few months.
David, follow up?
I appreciate Kate's response, but we've got to know, is this going to be ready for prime time, for instance, May 1st, 2015? If it is, the board can have a discussion about structuring all these dates around that particular action. If it's not going to be ready, then it's a superfluous discussion to have, and we really ought to be talking about a 2016 date or something like that.
Let me weigh in here from Massachusetts' perspective, and someone who's already kind of been at the forefront of this development of this database and were the first to contribute to it. The very difficult part of this database has to do with the tracking of an entity's identity relative to these allocations. And what I mean by that is this is this bridging where the states who permit individuals are trying to match up information with the federal government that permits so-called vessels. And it's occurred to us in these numerous conference calls that what's really critical is that the staff at NIMS and the staff in each state pay such attention to the contents of this database so that if some individual who owns a state permit and a state allocation changes boats or changes identity, goes into a corporation, or alternatively, when a NIMS permit changes its status or changes a registration, there's all kinds of things that have to be accounted for. So this means that the permit staff in Massachusetts and the permit staff in Rhode Island and the permit staff at NIMS have to be, and any other state that gets involved with this, have to actually take an extra step and make sure that this common database that's out there is intact, because if you don't, you're going to create the so-called pregnant boat syndrome that we've talked about in the last 10 years as being the one thing we wanted to avoid. And so where this database is right now is it's in testing, and the data's there, and I guess we're ready to maybe attempt a few transfers in a beta version of this. But the real reality is we have to make sure that the staff, the NIMS staff and the state staff actually understand the criticality of tracking the allocations to these entities and prevent the entities from drifting in the database, or from the database not capturing any changes that were made. So, we've really struggled with what is the common field that you can track this vessel? Is it registration number? Is it documentation number? Is it some other combination? And that's where it's at. So my view from Massachusetts is this database is really close, but I think it has to be tested through the fall to make sure that we can use it in our permitting offices, not necessarily in at the ACCSP where we're just transferring traps. You know, one of the crazy things that happens I'll give you an example. If a permit holder re-registers his boat, sells the boat to a corporation that he's the president of, you get a new registration number. And all of a sudden, if that's what you're using to track the allocation, the documentation number, the registration number, it's been lost. And so this database has to bring it back. Someone has to pay attention to that. So to your question, I'm nervous about this fall because if NIMS is still taking applications for the allocations as late as November 4th, I think, is the deadline, and my industry wants to start, moving traps in advance of the ordering of the trap tags, which we allow as early as January 1. I think we're going to be squeezed significantly. So, Peter, what kind of feedback would you like from the board today about the timing issues?
I think everything you said was spot on, Dan, but I also want to point out that this is complicated, and it's more than just developing a database and deducting 200 traps from one fisherman and adding 200 to another one. It's about, just like Dan said, it's about all the agencies being able to communicate on this. It's about having business rules and everything else working fully so that we can assure that this is going to work right. This is a pyramid we've been building for 10 years, and we're getting ready to put the top on it. And it'd be great if we can really roll this out in a way that that the commission and the board intended to do, which is to balance biological conservation on the stock, as well as provide some economic flexibility to the fishing fleet. So I think we have to realize that there's a lot to this, and I think in developing this database, people realized that there was a lot more to it than meets the eye. And even one recent issue that just came up is the ability, or how to account for multi-area transfers. I think the more and more we start talking about these database issues, the more issues come up and the more complexities come up. And I'm very confident that those things can be resolved. But as Dan mentioned, we're reaching the window of opportunity for trap transferability in calendar year 2014 is getting very small. To be able to do that in a way that we have the appropriate outreach to the fishing fleet to allow them to understand what transferability is. We're trying to wrestle with it internally here about what some of the issues are with it. I would like to have a situation where the public is very well advised before they start spending good money for lobster traps to know what they're getting into and what the implications of that are. So the timing becomes a critical thing, and a lot of moving parts here, but that's why we would really like to get some good comments from the board on how to implement this thing in a way that's going to meet the goals as intended.
Peter, do you think if we tried to stay on this schedule for transfers to begin in this next fishing year, that we would face kind of a breakdown or create problems for individual fishermen? I mean, are you forecasting some chaos? What do you say?
Are you asking if we did transferability in this current fishing year, 2014?
No, I think the schedule is expected to have you all accept applications through November, and if all goes well, then we would be you'd be qualifying and allocating almost instantaneously, and transfers would begin for next year. And in our state, we like to have those allocations already squared away by December 1st, which is our renewal period. And I guess I'm trying to anticipate what that would mean if people's allocations aren't established yet because of transfers that might be going on.
Right. Yeah, I think that would be complicated. I think administratively for the states and for NIMS, it would be complicated to be able to get everyone qualified and allocated, those that are qualified and allocated, to be able to tell them what their trap cutout allocation would be, and then allow them to transfer that way. I mean, we know that the states really work on a calendar year schedule, that they start taking orders for trap tags and start to issue licenses, I believe, at the beginning of the calendar year. And early in the calendar year is when NIMS begins to go through that same process. So like I said before, we're getting into a very compressed time frame right now.
Can we get feedback from members of the board as to the wisdom of postponing the trap cuts until the following year? David?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't support postponing the trap cuts. The whole reason we got in this scenario was the technical committee came forward with a suggestion to close the fishery, and Richie White brought this up before. That, I mean, they made a serious recommendation based on scientific advice, and the board started to take actions. And I know I'm repeating history here. And the industry basically dug in its heels and said, "Let us go find a different path." So we started down this path of trap cuts, and I actually think that the proposal that the industry has put forth has a lot of value in it. I mean, a 25% trap cut in Area 2 is a significant trap cut. All you have to do is look at, excuse me, at Bob Glenn's report, which is part of the lobster material, not in the supplemental material, but if you look at Figure 3, what you've got is you've got a situation here where the catch per unit of effort is actually going up. The overall effort is falling like a stone because abundance is either declining or whatever. But catch per unit of effort is actually starting to increase. And the last thing the resource needs to have a bunch of the latent effort come back into the fishery. That's not going to do the resource any good. So I think it's critical to get on with this whole process. I do not want to be perceived as minimizing the difficulties. I think Peter and all the states are confronting a really difficult chore in doing this, but we set out with a course of action. I think we got to follow up on it. But to me, the timeline that makes sense is Peter has already pre-qualified most of the federal participants, as I understand it. We all know that there are going to be people that are going to undergo director's appeals and that type of thing, but hopefully that's going to be the 5%. I think we should go forward under the assumption that we're going to cut the traps on April 30th, 2015, and do the transfers May 1st on 2015, and let the industry know, and basically let them have an application window of about 30 days where they can submit letters on the transfers. And the only reason I suggest 30 days, most people that want to transfer traps either own the traps or already have an agreement with somebody to purchase traps from them. So if the first year of the transfer program we have an expedited review process that's shortened, I don't think it's going to do a lot of harm. You could have a longer review process in the second or third year. I think we got to get on with this, is what I'm suggesting. So, given Kate's advice about the status of the database, I think that we should develop a timeline around those dates, basically circulate it to the industry, get comments and so forth. But by the November meeting, I think we have to decide definitely we're either going to do this on that schedule or we're going to postpone it to the following year. And that ought to be based on the facts at the time. Thank you.
I think it's critical for state personnel, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, any of the states that have members that are in the fleets that are going to be affected by this are going to have to make this a priority over the next few months, because I think that's one of the things that slows us all down at times is we all have a lot of other assignments to do, but I think if we're going to try to pull this off in time for this fall or next year, this is going to have to become really important back in our offices in the state, especially. Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't speak to you guys trying to meet timelines in the offices, but I agree with David. We should move forward with this as quickly as possible. And if we can't, I was just doing the quick math. If this takes another year, then I would suggest the first year cut be 28.75% to get us back on schedule. And that would be the 25 plus 5 right in there, and that would still get us right back into the 5-year schedule.
Maybe that's a comment you want to put on the record to NIMS, because that's one of the issues I think NIMS is looking for comments on. All right. Any other comments? Peter, want to follow up?
Yeah, I appreciate the comments by Mr. Train and Mr. Borden about, and I was interested to find that a lot of Area 3 participants were ready for transferability, but I was also wondering some of the other states whether they thought that was the case, where folks would be ready to go right away to begin transferring traps in the short term.
I would just like to point out for the board that, as Peter mentioned, that Area 3 already has taken the cut, so they can turn on transferability now. But with Area 2, that 25% reduction would need to be implemented first before the transferability to occur. And that is the way the board has discussed it previously, and would be looking for comment to ensure that that is the same message the board would like to submit to NOAA Fisheries.
All right. Okay, let's move on to the next item, review of consistency with federal trap transfer regulations. Kate? Just to follow up, do we have a position as a board? I'm not sure we do. I think it's critical for each of the states involved in this transfer addendum to weigh in, and Mark, you and I can talk, but I don't think we're going to create a board position necessarily today, but I think it's important that we comment officially on the record. All right, Kate, consistency with federal trap transfer regs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Peter mentioned, NIMS has published a final rule on implementation of the limited entry program in Area 2 and OCC, as well as their trap transfer program. While the majority of the measures implemented in the final rule are based on the Commission's recommendations and are consistent with the Commission's plan, there are a few measures which are either not consistent with the Commission's plan or the Commission's plan does not address the issue. Issue number 1 is the conservation tax of full business transfers. Under the final federal rule, a 10% transfer tax will be assessed on all partial allocation transfers, while the full business transfers, it's the sale of the entire permit, will not have a transfer tax. Under the Commission's plan, both the partial and the full business transfers are subject to the 10% transfer tax. Issue number 2 is conservation tax increments. Under the final federal rule, the trap transfers may be processed in a 10 trap increment, and while the Commission's plan does specify that an increment will be included, it does not specify what that increment is. Issue number 3 is the dual permit transfers. Under the trap transfer program, NOAA Fisheries will allow dual state and federal permit holders to purchase federal trap allocations from any other dual federal permit holder. Under the Commission's plan, a dual permit holder is restricted to transferring traps only to another dual permit holder from the same state. However, the Commission was supportive of this allowance in the proposed rule. And issue number 4 doesn't actually deal with the NOAA fisheries final rule. It is an issue that was brought up to staff's attention under Addendum 21. The addendum specified that an entity may not own more than 1,600 traps. However, those individuals who had more than 2 permits in December 2003 may retain the number that they had at that time, but may not own or share ownership of any additional permits. And that last sentence, the one that specifies those individuals who had more than 2 permits in December 2003, this was not included in the draft that the board reviewed, nor the document that went out for public comment, and this was mistakenly included in the final text of this section. This language could be removed through a technical addendum or the normal addendum process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Kate. Any questions for Kate on this presentation? All right. Hearing none, do we have any interest in creating a new addendum to resolve these discrepancies? David?
I don't have an answer for your question, Mr. Chairman, but I'd like to talk on just a couple of these points. On the conservation tax, a full business transfer, my understanding of both the commission plan and the federal rules require the most restrictive rules to go in place. So under the 10% partial transfer, the commission plan requires that both full and partial transfers be taxed. Okay, so that's the most restrictive. The fact that the National Marine Fisheries Service doesn't adopt that, as long as both the management agencies agreed to adhere to the most restrictive allocation, you're going to end up with a lower number of traps. Is that correct?
I guess that would be true, but I think it defeats one of the goals of this effort control plan that we've been working on with NIMS, where NIMS made every effort to sync up with the state allocations. So going forward in the database, we certainly didn't want to see a proliferation of different allocation totals per entity as a result of this disparate rule. And so I take your point that that was one of the objectives of the original plan, to sort of be more conservative and reduce trap allocations. We have to ask ourselves whether it's worth it to have more confounded records in the database, and whether the trap cuts that are scheduled, especially for Area 2, would suffice relative to the conservation goals.
Yeah, I'd offer the opinion that if you don't tax the full transfers, and people will use full transfers to avoid the tax, and the trap reductions will be that much less effective. So I think it's critical to, if you want consistency between the two sets of rules, I think we need to figure out a way to get the National Marine Fisheries Service to adopt the tax on full transfers, not vice versa.
Peter, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Keep in mind that we've got about 3,000 federal lobster permit holders, and almost 1,700, more than 50%, are in Area 1. And in Area 1, there's no way to deduct somebody's trap allocation for a full business transfer. And I'm speaking off the cuff right now, but I think that probably Maine, federal permit holders for Maine probably switch their permits more than anywhere else, their lobster permits. So this could be a considerable issue for an area that doesn't even have trap transferability, yet they're going to be subject to a tax whenever they make a business decision to switch boats or sell a permit. So that's over half of our permits every single time. We'd have to struggle with that. And unless Maine has a way to deduct somebody's state allocation consistent with a federal action, which we don't have right now, we're going to be in a real mess, because all we've tried to do with this whole trap transferability process is to try to match up with the states, knowing that 90% of federal lobster permit holders also have a state lobster license. And trap transferability is really an economic tool to allow somebody to buy partial transfers. This is something new, because under our regulations before that, the only way you could get access to lobster a lobster area was to buy a permit that qualified for that area and get those traps and all of the traps. Here, we're allowing people to pick part of someone's allocation, allowing someone to give away part of their allocation. So full business transfers is really kind of a selling of a whole business, where trap transferability is an exchange for an economic fine-tuning of somebody's lobster business.
And Peter, wouldn't it also entail sort of the policing or the monitoring of the membership of a corporation, that if a permit is held in a corporate name, one of the problems that we've encountered is trying to figure out, well, who's embedded in that corporation?
It would be one more riddle to solve in the trap transfer database, for sure.
So, is there any interest in doing an addendum with these disparate items to bring them in line with the federal regulations? Crickets. Are people not interested in creating that addendum? Can I get some discussion to not do that? Personally, I'd be in favor of seeing this addendum, because I'm trying to deal with in Massachusetts, my allocation holders, and I want a clean rule. I've got ASMFC rules that aren't consistent with the way we're going to go forward with this in this federal plan. Steve, help me.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the problem we've got, because we want to be consistent, but if I were to buy a new boat, that's a permit transfer, and then I'd be cut 10%. So I understand this. So I think we need to, I want to keep this 10%, but I think we need to wait a while and work on how we get it to apply. Because if you sell your whole business, I don't think it's a problem if you cut 10% and then the guy has to go find some other tags and build back up to the limit. But if it's not going to match up because of the way you read permit transfer, whether it could be a new vessel or a divorce or something, and the name on the permit changes and now it's a transfer, you shouldn't be hit with a 10%. So I do think we need to work on that. But the intent of what we were doing, I don't think, was to have that happen.
Peter Burns, if someone like Steve replaces his vessel, that's not considered a transfer, is it, if the permit remains in that entity's name?
I think if there's a vessel replacement, or if there's a sell of a business to somebody else, would be considered a full business transfer.
Even in the case of a vessel sinking, if the vessel was gone and someone bought a new vessel, that's considered a permit transfer?
So. Yeah, I think so. I think that is what we defined a full business transfer as: any type of transfer of a vessel, a permit to another. Take a federal permit and put it from one boat to another, whether it's your boat or somebody else's boat.
Yeah, and Steve, that sort of speaks to the problem, is that in the States we issue permits to people, and when that person comes in and says, hey, I want to replace my vessel, we don't consider that a permit transfer. So that's why we need to have more consistent language.
Yeah, I'd like to see the 10% stay, but maybe we need to work with NIMS to get them to come up with what we consider a transfer and what they consider a transfer before we bring them in line to our way of thinking. In the meantime, we have to wait a little bit.
Well, I think this is a core issue with this database, because NIMS is going to make all these efforts to sync up, and then if we have a state standard that if someone changes their or if they transfer the permit or change the vessel, that allocation does not get debited, but at the state level it does, I think that constitutes a problem for us. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree, Dan. I think that, like I said before, I think we're getting too. We're trying to address two issues with one tool. This particular thing deals with trap transferability, and we only have trap transferability in 3 areas: Area 2, the Outer Cape, and Area 3. There's only a trap cap in Area 1, so there's no way to deduct anyone's allocation. So if the idea is to really reduce traps more in Maine, and maybe this isn't the way to do that. And so maybe that's another addendum with a different reason for trying to get trap reductions. And maybe this isn't really the way to do that, because I think that I think that the Area 1 issue is going to come into play in this.
Terry Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on Peter saying that this would be a very big deal in Area 1. And applying this measure to all lobster management areas at this time would introduce a currency into Area 1 that we've not discussed in the past, and I would be reluctant, actually I wouldn't be reluctant, I would be adamantly not supporting initiation of an addendum at this time.
Terry, I think the addendum would alter the ASMFC trap transfer standards to make it more like NIMS, so it would meet your expectations. The addendum would not make it would not result in a situation where the traps were debited. We want to eliminate that language. I'm sorry. The idea is to eliminate that language from the ASMFC plan to make it more consistent with the federal rules.
My expectations, if I could follow up, would be to certainly consult with our industry before I'd be at all prepared to discuss this issue at the table.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is an issue that's been hanging out there for a bit. Doesn't have to be resolved today. So if you could have those conversations with your industry, and we'll pick this up in November, if you don't mind. David.
Sorry to talk so much, Mr. Chairman, but this actually is a very important point. If we did this is a question for Peter, and Chip Lynch, I think, is also here. If we did an addendum that exempted Area 1 from this provision, or any area, Area 6 if need be, from this provision, would the problem go away? In other words, could they adopt a 10% transfer tax on the other areas?
Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I understand Peter, though, if anyone in Area 2 or 3 bought a new boat, took on a partner, or in any way had to change their permit, they would have to take a 10% cut. I think that's where we're not matching things up.
Well, I think that, again, this is the crux of the matter, and this is why the database is so challenging. NIMS is permitting vessels, or the owners of vessels, where we, the states, permitting individuals. So it's very easy when we deal with the permitting issues in the states to say, someone like Steve Train, you have now sold your permit, or you've transferred your permit, and the new holder is going to be debited. But the problem is the use of corporate shield, so to speak. It's possible for that corporate makeup to simply shift with a new partner, and that's very difficult for the states and NIMS to sort of be chasing down. And I think that's part of NIMS's challenge as well. It's in terms of administrative burden. Is it not, Peter?
It's definitely a challenge, and really getting more toward David Borden's point is that you can try to isolate this on an area-by-area basis, but what it comes down to is that most federal lobster permits have more than one lobster management area, so you just keep drilling down more and more when you try to compartmentalize something that really isn't constructed to handle that.
David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This obviously is a very complicated issue. Can I suggest that, unless somebody has objection, that the chair appoint a subcommittee to focus in on this and with the staff and try to bring a recommendation forward at the next board meeting?
I'd be happy to do that. And can I construct the subcommittee of a representative from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, NIMS. Any other state want to be involved? Terry? Anyone else? All right, that's the plan. Thank you, David. Good solution. The next item is stock assessment update. Bob Glenn. Oh, sorry, Doug Grouch, do you want to come back?
Just a thought here. There was issue 4 here was a mistaken wording that was included in addendum 21, and I'm wondering if we would be willing to just let the staff move forward with a technical addendum that would essentially remove those words that were put in there that were never put out for public comment or commission consideration, or whether you want to try and wrap this into a formal addendum. It seems like this would be a quick and easy thing to do between now and the next commission meeting.
And that is something that the staff could either draft up and send around to the management board for their review, since it is a very easy addendum, and there could be a public comment period before the annual meeting, or if the board would like to review it at annual meeting, we can do that as well.
Do you need a motion to try and do this, or can we do this by consensus? I mean, this is I'll be glad to make the motion if you want me to move forward with that direction, Mr. Chair, but...
Sure, Doug, we'll take the motion.
All right, I would move that the board initiate a technical addendum that would remove the wording in addendum 21 that was inadvertently put in there. If you want me to be more specific, I'd need to get that slide up again.
Kate tells me that's sufficient.
Okay.
Second, Mark Gibson. Discussion. Any objection to the motion? If not, by consensus, we'll move forward with that. All right, the next item is the stock assessment update from Bob Glenn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to provide you with an update of where we are at with the stock assessment, and then also put together a presentation giving you kind of a thumbnail sketch of each stock right now based on the model-free indicators. So we have so far for the stock assessment, we finally have finalized all the landings data. We had a few issues with Mass, Rhode Island, and New York landings that have been identified, and those problems have been corrected. And as such, right now, staff is going to start to work on and finalize the catch-up length matrix, which is the primary piece of information that we needed to get the model runs going. This assessment will include data through 2013. We've updated catch and survey indices to include data through 2013. The Lobster Stock Assessment Committee meets in September, and at this September meeting is when we will commence model runs and start to look at those for each of the stocks. And right now, the assessment completion is due to be late winter, early spring of 2015, to be presented at the board on May 2015 meeting. So I'm going to move right into a preview of the stock assessment using some stock indicators. These are model-free indicators of abundance and exploitation. as well as fishery indicators. I'm not going to comprehensively show all of those because we have dozens of them for each stock that we look at. So what I chose is just a handful of probably the ones that convey the most meaning and provide a decent thumbnail sketch of the condition for each of the 3 stocks. I'm going to start with the Gulf of Maine first. Looking at abundance indicators for the Gulf of Maine, the 2 primary ones that we look at are the spawning stock biomass. That would be the figure on the left, and we have 3 indices for that. We have that generated from the Maine New Hampshire survey, the one generated from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center survey, and one that we generate from the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries Inshore survey. And they all in general, what those 3 indices show is that spawning stock biomass is extremely high in the Gulf of Maine, above the 75th percentile in all cases, with the exception of the most recent index from Maine New Hampshire survey notes a decline in the terminal year to 2013. When we look at the full recruit abundance, those are those animals that currently are or will recruit to the fishery in the current fishing year. We look at those survey indices over time, and all 3 of the indices indicate that overall abundance of the adult stock is extremely high at this point. It's within some of the highest levels that we've observed. We look at recruitment factors for the Gulf of Maine. Specifically, we look at the Young of the Year settlement survey that's conducted in Maine, New Hampshire, and in Massachusetts. And I've broken it down into 4 basic regions, starting with Area 511, which is eastern Maine, moving down to 512, which is mid-coast, 513, east and west, which is southern Maine, as well as New Hampshire, and then finally Area 514, which is the Gulf of Maine. And what you'll notice about these indices is that they're fairly noisy, and that's fairly typical of Young of the Year indices because there's a lot of interannual variability in both settlement strength as well as environmental conditions that dictate what happens. The TC is somewhat concerned. If you look, they do follow a similar trend in terminal years where you see in 2013 all of those indices drop pretty dramatically. It is something that we're watching. 1 or 2 years of lower settlement indices doesn't necessarily spell disaster, but it is certainly something for the technical committee and for the management board just to continue to monitor to see what prevails, and that's something that we'll provide more insight on in the upcoming stock assessment. What we can use as a mortality indicator is a relative exploitation rate, which is simply just the ratio of the survey to the landings, to the commercial catch, and to give us a relative idea of what fishing mortality may look like. And if you look, we have some varying trends. The green line up there is in the southern portion of the Gulf of Maine and Mass Area 514. And what you can see is that we've had a fairly dramatic decline in relative exploitation rate. And what that just simply means is that, in this case, is that the survey index has increased at a faster rate than the commercial catch has, and gives us an idea that exploitation rates may be declining in that area. If you look at the blue line, which is from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and that would be all of the Gulf of Maine, but more in offshore waters, not state waters. Overall, it's for the last 25 years or so, it's kind of varied without trend. I mean, there's some ups and downs, but it's been fairly stable if you were to draw a trend line through that. The Maine, New Hampshire survey, the red line, is a smaller time series, and that was fairly stable from its inception in around year 2000 through about 2012, and then 2011, and then that's bumped up in the last couple of years. So that's just another thing occurring in the Gulf of Maine stock, and specifically off the coast of Maine, that is something to watch. It's not at full alarm at this point, but we are seeing indicators that possibly exploitation rates are increasing there, despite there being record abundance. Commercial catch is no surprise. The figure on the left is the total commercial catch for the Gulf of Maine, and then the one on the right is that those data broken down into statistical reporting areas. The graph speaks for itself. There's been a dramatic increase in catch over the course of the time series, and in the last few years, that increase doesn't seem to have any limits. It continues to increase pretty rapidly. If you look at the graph on the right, it can give you some insight as to where those increases are coming from. And largely, while we do see increases in all of the stat areas, the largest increases have been specifically in both Mid-Coast Maine, Area 512, as well as Eastern Maine and Area 511, with more modest increases in the southern portion of the Gulf of Maine, 513 and 514. And finally, the line on the very bottom, it's Area 515. It's somewhat swamped. Any trends there are somewhat swamped by the magnitude of the catch in other areas, but that's the offshore Gulf of Maine, and landings have kind of varied, but kind of stayed fairly consistent over time there. So if we summarize this and kind of give you a report card for the Gulf of Maine as an early indicator of, stock appears to be in good condition. Abundance is at or near time series high. We warn give a little bit of caution with the exploitation rate, because we've seen a relatively large increase in the main index for relative exploitation in recent years, so it's something to watch. Recruitment is a cautionary as well, and there are 2 consecutive years of poor YOY settlement, and this could lead to future declines in catch and should be monitored closely. And finally, looking at catch trends, there's been dramatic increases in catch, and the fishery appears to be strong. Moving to Georges Bank. Similar to what we saw, this is a situation that we saw in the Gulf of Maine, is that we've seen both strong increases in the spawning stock biomass on Georges Bank, as well as strong increases in the full recruit abundance on Georges Bank. We only have one survey index that covers this area. That's the Northeast Fisheries Science Center survey. But in all indications is that both of these indicators were varied or were consistent for the earlier part of the time series through to about year 2000, when we've seen dramatic increases in both. Looking at relative exploitation for that area, there's some interannual variation. However, overall, the relative exploitation rate has remained fairly stable over time, or varied without trend. And then finally, if you look at the fisheries indicator, in this case commercial catch, you see the figure on the left is the total commercial catch on Georges Bank, and this follows much like the abundance trends that we see in the survey index, and that since about the year 2000, seen a fairly dramatic increase in commercial catch on the Georges Bank stock. The very noisy figure to the right is the breakdown by statistical area, and if you look at that, what you can see is that there is a fair amount of interannual variability in catch in that area, and which is kind of different than what you see in the Gulf of Maine, where you tend to see more stable patterns. Some of this can be possibly attributed to how catch is reported, because out on Georges Bank, a lot of the boats fish in multiple stat areas on a given trip, so there tends to be a little bit of variability in reporting as to how many pounds came from Area 561 or Area 562 when they possibly fished both in the same trip. But overall, the total trend in catch is pretty telltale of what's happening there. Summarizing Georges Bank, the stock appears to be in good condition. The abundance is at or near time series high. Exploitation rates have remained consistent and seem to be stable. A little bit of a cautionary note on recruitment is that we don't have a young of the year, a larval survey, or eventless trap survey for Georges Bank to provide a good indicator of recruitment. So managers should use caution, because we do not have a good forecast of incoming recruitment for the stock. And then finally, catch on Georges Bank has increased dramatically in recent years, and the fishery appears to be strong. Moving to southern New England, some of the punchlines for southern New England were already covered by Mark Gibson and Dave Simpson, but I'll continue to go over it regardless. If we look at overall abundance indicators, looking at spawn stock biomass, and we're using the Connecticut, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and the Rhode Island survey for spawning stock biomass, and what you see is that for both of the inshore surveys, Connecticut and Rhode Island, the spawning stock biomass indices in 2013 were the all-time time series low, and that for the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, which would be the blue line, is that it has declined from the highs observed in the late 1990s, and it's off the axis. There is some spawning stock biomass from being seen in that survey, but overall it's fairly low. When we look at the similar trends for full recruit abundance in southern New England, based on those same 3 surveys, you see basically the same trend in that the inshore survey indices in both Connecticut and Rhode Island. We haven't historically used the mass survey as one of the stock indicators, but if I were to throw those trends up there, you would see a similar trend in that the full recruit abundance for the southern New England portion of the mass survey is at or near all-time lows as well. So there seems to be a pretty consistent regional trend in stock abundance for southern New England, and that it's at or near all-time lows. We have a couple of different recruitment indicators for southern New England. 2 of the states, Rhode Island and Massachusetts, use the Young of the Year suction sampling survey. That would be the figure on the left. Rhode Island is the green line, Massachusetts is the blue line, and overall, the Young of the Year settlement indices are very low. You note that in 2013 they've come up from the low of 0, but in context to the time series, they're still well below the 25th percentile in abundance or density of Young of the Year. So the condition overall is a very poor settlement. On the right, we're looking in Long Island Sound, which is the Long Island Sound larval indices. The red line is from Western Long Island Sound and was traditionally conducted by Connecticut DEP, their larval survey, and that's looking at the index of the number of 4-stage lobster larvae per 1,000 cubic meters. And overall, looking at that, the index is extremely low for the last 10 years, and dramatically lower than what was observed from in the mid to late 1990s. Similarly, the blue line is conducted by the Dominion Power Plant. That includes all larval stages, so it's on a different axis because it would relate to the left y-axis in this case, because when you use all larval stages, the overall magnitude of the catch is much higher than just the 4th stage. Nonetheless, it shows a very similar trend in that overall the lobster larval densities observed in eastern Long Island Sound are at or near time series low as well. Looking at some of the mortality indicators, so we have the relative exploitation rate based on the Rhode Island survey as well as the Connecticut survey. You see a fair amount of interannual variability. There's a very stable period of relative exploitation from throughout the 1980s into late 1990s, and then you see larger increases in the early 2000s, followed by decline. And then in both cases, in the recent years, 2012 and 11, you see some increases in the relative exploitation rate, which indicates, in this case, is that the abundance of the stock is declining at a faster rate than the commercial catches, despite the attrition that we're seeing. So overall, this is an indicator that's possible that despite reductions in catch and despite the management efforts that have been made to protect what's left of the southern New England stock, the stock still appears to be declining at a faster rate than the commercial catches. This is looking at the commercial catch for southern New England. The line on the left is the entire catch combined. 2011 and 2012 will mark the two lowest points in the time series for commercial catch in southern New England. The entire catch is hovering just slightly below 4 million pounds, and that's the lowest in the time series. When you break that down by statistical area, you can see it has varied. Some areas have stayed fairly consistent over time. Others have declined. The largest notable declines that have been observed were in area 611, which is Long Island Sound, as well as statistical area 539, which is Rhode Island coast of Rhode Island Sound and Narragansett Bay. And then you also see more declines, but more modest declines in offshore area 537, which is both LMA2 and LMA3, as well as the inshore portion of Massachusetts, area 538, has declined, but not to nearly to the same degree. Overall, we summarize the condition of the southern New England stock is that it appears to be in poor condition. Abundance is at or near time series low. Exploitation rates have increased in recent years. The stock size declines faster than commercial catch. Young of the year settlement continues to be extremely low, and TC feels that the recruitment failure still appears to be occurring. And finally, a slight warning about commercial catch. We've seen large declines in commercial catch. However, we're having reports throughout all the various jurisdictions, Mass, LMA2, LMA3, LMA5 in New Jersey. We're having reports that catch per unit effort has increased or remained stable for those fishing. And that's not a surprise. And with the dramatic attrition in the fishery has allowed the remaining fishermen to benefit. So essentially you're taking this piece of pie and cutting up fewer pieces, cutting up amongst fewer fishermen. The remaining pie pieces are larger. So the TC cautions the board that with the interpretation of CPU indices, and just warns them that they're very poor indicators of abundance. And that's it.
Thank you, Bob. Kate, it might be useful to share this PowerPoint presentation with the whole board electronically, because some of the colors might be difficult to have read. But yes, David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question about the Gulf of Maine recruitment numbers for the last couple of years. Is there any aspect of your survey work that would let you understand whether or not the rising water temperature or ocean acidification is beginning to have an effect in that area?
Yes, and at least with temperature, one of the things that the assessment committee is doing in this assessment is looking at temperature time series trends in all the stock units to see how those may affect overall stock productivity, natural mortality, and things like recruitment. In the Gulf of Maine, temperature effects are possible. It's hard to speculate at this point, but we would anticipate to hopefully provide some insight on that.
Follow-up, David?
If I may, and I wonder if there's anything in the literature or what you've seen about acidification, particularly related to fertility.
There's been a lot in the literature about ocean acidification. Most that I've seen so far has been mostly focusing on bivalve shellfish and the inability for the spat to survive and lay down. There has been some work currently being conducted looking into see if there's any relationship with that and the increased incidence of shell disease. That hasn't been definitive work on that hasn't been published, but it is being considered at this time.
Any other questions for Bob? Mark Gibson?
Yeah, Bob, I noticed you don't think I missed it, but you didn't mention anything about the ventless trap surveys. Is that just because of volume of information, or are they being brought to bear on the stock assessment?
The answer is yes, Mark. I didn't, just because of the volume information, I only took a select handful of indicators that I could show similar trends, similar indicators for all three stocks. For this assessment, will mark the first time that the ventless trap survey index will be included in the base model runs for each stock. And overall, looking at specifically in southern New England's case, the ventless trap surveys for southern New England states kind of mirror what's going on in the trawl surveys, and that where the indexes in the most recent years are at time series lows.
Emerson Asbrook next.
Thank you. One of the slides I think that you had up there said that the assessment committee was going to meet in, was it September or October?
September.
Thank you. And where are they going to meet?
That meeting is going to be held at the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries offices in New Bedford.
Thank you.
Anyone else? David Borden.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Bob, is assessment going to deal with describing connectivity issues between the inshore and offshore stocks at all?
That question, yeah, we're looking into that. Are you specific to southern New England or? Yeah.
Actually, I was asking the question based on the Georges Bank, Gulf of Maine connections.
Yeah, we're specifically going to address that issue, and that the plan is to run, in addition to the base models with all three stock units separated as they have traditionally been done, we plan on doing an alternate run that includes, it's a combined Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank run together. And this is based on some preliminary work that we've done trying to resolve some of the issues on Georges Bank specifically and that the model has a hard time dealing with, and namely trying to figure out where recruitment comes from in that stock. And we're seeing large increases in abundance there, large increases in especially large changes in the sex ratio towards females, and some other trends going on out on Georges Bank that the Georges Bank model itself, and Jenny Nesledge here can certainly jump in at any point if she wants to on this, because she's one of our primary modelers. But so anyways, we're trying to address some of the dynamics issues that we're seeing in the Georges Bank, and we think some of that can be reconciled when we look at it as Georges Bank and Gulf of Maine combined, because there's a lot of trends, a lot of similar trends, as well as there's a lot of historical literature that would support a fair migration between those two stock units.
Mark Gibson, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question that David did about southern New England. We're going to be able to, at some, when we receive the stock assessment, draw conclusions about area-specific dynamics. It's clear that the inshore trawl surveys have collapsed nearly to zero, but the federal trawl survey hasn't collapsed that to that lower level, and you probably have NEMAP information as well. And some of the landing streams are showing similar patterns. So, CPUE is really well pointed out, and I think it's an important point. The catch per trap haul has remained high in some areas where there are still some people fishing and finding remaining pockets of lobsters. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to nuance some of the area-specific information and perhaps react to that.
Yeah, the Stock Assessment Committee will try to provide some insight into those inshore-offshore dynamics. It's somewhat difficult to do so on, say, the lobster management area level because none of the surveys or catch information is collected on that type of spatial resolution. That said, we'll try to provide insight on that. The other thing that we'll try to tackle is what we're unsure about is if inshore stock has declined to such a low level, and we're seeing recruitment failure. The traditional model in our heads was that, or not in our heads, but the traditional thinking on it was that the strong inshore-offshore link between that is that settlement occurred inshore, those animals would grow up, and as they get larger, they migrate offshore. And there's certainly historical tagging studies have as well as looking at larval drift studies have supported that. What the TC will have a difficult time trying to resolve is what the southern New England stock will continue to look like in the absence of any contribution from an inshore, or in the absence of a strong contribution from the inshore component. But we're hopeful to try to provide some insight on that.
Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing that sort of confuses me a little bit is a lot of times the abundance and the good report for the Gulf of Maine has been teamed as being partly due to the increase in water temperature. On the other hand, down in southern New England, when we had the disaster, it was the water got too warm, so they left, or whatever. And so I go, well, up here it's doing good things, and down there it's making things worse. And this is just a comment, and I don't know what the answer is, but I just wanted to say, you know, this is getting confusing in that respect.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Bill. The interesting thing between, say, the difference in southern New England and Georges Bank in the Gulf of Maine is that the southern New England is at the southern extent of where lobsters live. So the water temperatures there historically were supportive of all the life history processes for lobster. And what we found is that as sea temperature has increased, for 20 degrees Celsius or 67 degrees Fahrenheit roughly, it appears to be kind of the threshold for many different processes, as well as increased physiological stress. So as temperature has increased, the waters in southern New England, the number of days where that exceed that thermal threshold of 67 degrees has gone up substantially in the last decade. When you go north of Cape Cod, it never really approaches those thermal thresholds, if at all, very little if at all. And in fact, what we've seen is in the case of a lot of the reproductive biology, namely larval duration, things like larval maturation, the larval duration, other things like that, settlement. These slight increases in temperature that we've seen in the Gulf of Maine have likely been a positive factor. So it's not approaching those threshold levels, but they're actually providing enhanced larval survival.
Okay, thank you, Bob. That's a great report, and we look forward to the final product when it comes out next year. All right, I think we're on to item number 10. Oh, Dave Simpson, did you have something?
For item 10.
I'm sorry. For item 10, we're seeking a vice chair, and I'd be looking for nominations. David?
I'd like to nominate Dave Borden as vice chair.
Is there a second to that nomination? Richie White, thank you. Any second nominations from the floor? No, I don't see any. All in favor of David as vice chair of the American Lobster Board? Raise your hand. Any in opposition? Seeing none, passes unanimously. Thank you. Sorry, your delegation voted yes. All right, is there any other business to come before this board today? Yes, Peter Burns.
Just one comment. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to let folks know, I believe that our proposed rule for the trap cuts was supplied with the supplemental materials for the board members, so if you didn't get it there, let me know. But I've got about 10 copies that I'm going to put out on the back table here for the public or anyone else who may be interested. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
And Peter, I'll make sure that the affected states do comment on your proposed rule. And I didn't take or ask for a board position today because I still think things need to be worked out that are complex, but I'll make sure you get comments on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, motion to adjourn? Thank you. This meeting's adjourned.